Ralph. I'm chairing this session this afternoon. It's lots of delegates here I can see. It's also open to the public, and our hope is this is year 2 having an open session to the public, and our hope is that people will come in and hear some stuff that's going on in the mining sector, and if they have questions or concerns or are curious about stuff, it's an opportunity to ask either during the session or after the session. You can put some faces to some names of people who are involved in the industry and the associated businesses. But we thought we'd start this afternoon because we know there's a lot of public interest in what's going on up at Eagle Mine, and Erin Dowd with Department of Energy, Mines and Resources, she's part of the Mineral Resources branch, and she's been the lead responder, I guess, on behalf of the department for the Eagle situation since June 2024. So in early July, as you know, the expert panel report came out, and so Erin's just going to give a high-level recap of the contents of that. It's a document online, but it's pretty chewy, and so not something that everybody necessarily wants to digest without a little bit of help. Thanks, Erin.
Is this here?
Yes, that's correct.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. So as Carolyn said, I'm going to do a quick overview of what's happened since last year, since the Eagle Gold Mine failure. Talk a little bit about what caused the failure, what did the independent review board say, look at what the response efforts have been to date, some lessons learned, what the review board has recommended, and then what the next steps are from here. So just as a reminder, the Eagle Gold Mine is in the kind of the heart of the Yukon in the traditional territory of the Notchunayakdun. And you can see here, I actually don't know how to use the pointer. You can see here just the overlay of the mine site, an open pit mine, heap leach facility. You can see where the various different facilities are on here as the state of the mine pre-failure. So as a reminder, this happened on June 24th, as Carolyn just said. 4 million tons of material moved in the failure event. That's about 10% of the facility. 2 million of that escaped containment. What we mean by that is it went over the embankment and into the environment, which you can see here, going into the Dublin Gulch Valley. This resulted in the release of cyanide solution and the ore material into the environment. And the immediate focus of that, following the failure, was the containment and the management of the solution that came out of the facility. So we'll start with how did this happen? And so there was an independent review board that was struck in August of 2024. They've issued a very comprehensive report. It's 900 pages. It goes into the nitty-gritty if you really want to get into that detail. I'm just going to give the very high-level touch on what that report said. So what the report concluded was this was a rotational failure that led to a liquefaction flow slide. So the liquefaction requires 2 conditions, so contractive material, so material that can be compressed, and saturated or nearly saturated conditions. In the context of a heap leach facility, this is important because you expect those conditions. So those conditions are what you anticipate in a heap leach. And so what the board was then focused on was determining the trigger for this failure event that led to the liquefaction flow. So they identified 5 separate and contributing causes to this, and without all 5, you wouldn't have gotten this same failure, the catastrophic failure, and wouldn't have happened on this date. The first one being variability of ore. Not that the ore was variable, that the ore wasn't managed appropriately for its variability. So making sure that you're doing the proper management processes to stack it and make sure that it's in the right locations. The second thing that they identified was the impairment of the solution collection system. So underlying a heap leach facility, you have a series of pipes that collect the solution and bring it down into a containment pond. And so in this case, it's an in-heap pond behind that embankment. And so what the report concluded was that there was impairment of that collection system, both in the perforations in the pipes, so the areas where they're supposed to have solution coming in were blocked by material that was smaller than anticipated, that the connections, so you have your pipes and you have all your many little pipes that go to the main pipe, the connections between those weren't installed properly or had been impacted. So there wasn't the right collection of that solution, creating some different mounds of the solution within the facility. They also determined that there was oversteepened slopes. So the design of the facility had a slope of 2.8 to 1. The construction of this facility aimed for a 2.5 to 1. And when they were constructing the facility, they built a road up the face of the heap that wasn't in the design. And that created some benches that were quite far apart, quite high, and in those areas, it was more on the order of 1.4 to 1, so almost double the slope that was anticipated. And then coupled with the ore variability, they had a water accumulation, so a rising perched water table. So some of the material that was encountered was not the best material. They put it in one location, and what it resulted in was not being as permeable as other material, and having that coupled with the solution collection, creating this rise water table within the facility. And then with the contractive ore that we spoke about earlier and those conditions, it created a situation where you could have liquefaction. And the way that Mark Smith, I don't know if he's in the room here, has described it many times is, if you have a water bottle and the cap is open a little bit, you can have water coming out of it slowly, but if you stomp on it, it all comes out, and that's kind of what happened here. And then speaking about those are the causes of the failures, but there's many things that kind of contributed to that and brought us to those causes. I spoke about the quality control measures, making sure that you had the right types of ore, blending it, putting it in the right locations, making sure that you're monitoring appropriately in the right locations for the right data, and taking that information and putting it into practice to say, I'm seeing this, here's what I'm doing. And then a disconnect between what was designed and what was being built on the site. And all of those kind of came together that brought us to that failure event. And so this happened in June. What did Yukon government do about this? What happened? How did we respond? So I've split this into two, kind of a governance response, and then we'll talk about the technical response afterwards. So on a governance response, immediately Yukon government started issuing directions both on a regulatory level and an enforcement level. And those are really focused on improving safety, improving the geotechnical stability, making sure that the environmental protections were increased and adequate for the site, and capturing and treating that contaminated water before it enters into the environment. We also worked really closely with the First Nation of Notchunaq-Dun to come up with what those directions should be, working with our federal agency partners as well, and developed what the response could be on a very collaborative basis. Yukon government also applied to the court when many of those recommendations or the directions weren't being adhered to, applied to the court to have a receiver appointed, and PricewaterhouseCoopers was appointed as that receiver in August. And in that same month, in August, we established the Independent Review Board to investigate the cause of the failure, not look at the fault of who caused it, but what happened, and then we also asked them to come up with some recommendations of how could we do this better in the future. On a technical side, we really focused on environmental responses. What do we have to do to protect the environment, improve the protections of the environment? How do we improve the health and safety conditions for people working on the site? How do we reduce or prevent impacts both on-site and downstream? And how do we improve the geotechnical stability of the site? So on a geotechnical stability side, this is really focused on making sure people are safe when they're doing their work, making sure that there's a really clear understanding of what has to happen, and when those actions are being taken, that the people doing that work are doing it safely. One of those things was the construction of the safety berm that we talked about last year, and that was just to create a safety berm to improve the conditions in the camp, and then also make it so that the people who were going to be required to work in the valley to install groundwater wells had a location that they could be in safely. And then one of the other things that we spoke about, I believe, last year is the heap leach facility was being recirculated with solution, which means it's still saturated, there's still a lot of water stored in that heap. So the teams on site installed a horizontal well that goes from one side of the facility all the way to the other, and it dips down into that in-heap pond. So the pump could be put in there and start pumping out that water to reduce the liquid in the heap and increase the stability. And then, of course, moving the material from the failed zone, unloading those areas so that you reduce the likelihood and the chance of a secondary failure. So that work is ongoing right now, and that's about 1 million tons of material that's anticipated to be moved in this first phase, which will then allow further investigations to happen to see what has to happen next to further improve the stability. Water management, I think you've heard a lot about this in the media over the last year. It's been the true focus of the work on site is water management. And when I say water, it's the cyanide impacted water, so the solutions, but also the water that runs over waste rock that goes into the open pit area that might have high metals but isn't impacted by cyanide. And so to make sure that the water that's contaminated is staying on site, it's not being released into the environment before it's treated, there were seven storage ponds that were constructed. Over 500,000 cubic meters of additional storage space was created with these ponds. And these ponds allowed for water to be collected and stored while the water treatment plant was being commissioned. So to get water to those ponds, you need a pretty vast array of conveyance networks. And so one of the first slides I showed was just the size of the site. And so bringing water from the heap leach facility across to the other side of the site, back to the water treatment plant, to the environment, required a lot of pipes, pumps, all of that type of infrastructure. And all of this was really just to prevent water from overtopping and going into the environment. And then that leads to water treatment. Until you can treat the water, you have to store the water. So the water treatment plant that was on site was not sufficient to treat cyanide. So there had to be a lot of improvements to that treatment plant. It's a very complex water treatment system. The water treatment provider, BQE, on site has worked tirelessly since they got to site to be able to treat that water and discharge it. And so they were successful in being able to treat water. They've treated over 1 million cubic meters of water and discharged it to the system. And then there was also a separate system that was separating that non-cyanide water, that contact water, into a separate stream that was being treated with flocculants and then released into the environment. And then environmental management, there's an extensive monitoring network. You can see from here, it's a really terrible slide, but there's a ton of monitoring stations on site, downgrading of site, and then all the way to the South McQuestion, so down 27 kilometers of Haggart Creek. So there's water samples that are happening in some sites more than once daily. They're happening a couple times a day. I think over 7,000 water samples have been taken by the receiver and Victoria Gold Corporation just on their own, and then additional samples by Yukon government and First Nation Natchitoches done as well. There's also 35 new groundwater wells installed on the site to be able to understand where the groundwater is flowing and how impacted that is. And that leads to the interception and making sure that we can collect all of that contaminated water before it reports to the environment. And I think important to note that environmental management, the environmental monitoring, and the responses from that monitoring, that happens regardless of what activities are happening on site. So no matter what, whether you're doing construction activities or if we're into a monitoring maintenance mode, this environmental monitoring network is going to be there to be able to watch what's happening and then identify if any new actions have to happen on site to reduce impacts. And so what's happening now? I think we can all say is the failure event, it impacted the surface water, it impacted the groundwater, and that monitoring program that we just spoke about is so important to understand those impacts and be able to understand what actions have to happen on site to reduce them or prevent them, mitigate those impacts, and make sure that they're not getting worse. So all of that monitoring data has informed what we're doing on site. And I'll show you a few slides here. It's showing a very measurable improvement to those conditions as over time. So you can see what's happening on site is having an effect in the environment. And there's been many studies over the last year that are continuing this year on the water courses, on the aquatics, on wildlife. You're looking at benthics and sediments in the streams. To date, these studies have not shown a far-field impact from the failure event. They're ongoing. We're still gathering more information and analyzing that, but for now, we're not seeing impacts far downstream. And it's a little bit hard to see here, but this is the surface water conditions. And I don't know if you can see the colors very well, but I'll point here. This is here, the blue is kind of the last point of control on the mine site. And then further down from that, you can see the step down. That's 6 kilometers downstream at the confluence of the Lynx Creek, and then down to the McQuestion River down below. So what's important to note here is you can see at the beginning that spike that was from that initial discharge event that was reported. And then you can see a quick drop, and that's from when the Dublin Gulch diversion was extended. So there was a direction to extend that diversion. That was extended, and you can see a measurable drop in the conditions. And then you can also see a rise in the water quality over the winter months, and as we heard from Chief Hope yesterday, attributed to the groundwater contributing to conditions in the creek. And then we can see when the water treatment plants began to discharge, you can start seeing a decrease in the impacts on the environment. And then when the pumping and the groundwater interception fences started, you can see a further decrease. And again here, this is the groundwater. So if you look here, this is the main interception fence. We call them a series of wells that are there to intercept the water. And then a further fence down below. And what you can see here is, you can see the high groundwater levels, and then you can see where the interception starts, where that gray bar is, how quickly it starts to drop in the downstream or the down gradient wells. So what we're doing there is you're measuring the quality of the water closer to Haggart Creek and seeing how it's impacted by intercepting water further upstream. And you can see that it has a marked improvement in those conditions. And then, of course, the continuing work, there's lots of programs on fisheries, aquatics, wildlife that are continuing to happen. They'll happen again next year. There'll be more work on the heap leach facility. It's happening right now. It will continue through the winter months. We'll continue to sample the environment, understand if any additional impacts are occurring and how we have to respond to that. And then, of course, preparing for the spring melt. And I see I have 2.5 minutes, so I'll go quickly. And so what's next? The Independent Review Board released their report, and there was 56 recommendations in that report. Those looked at the regulatory enforcement oversight of mining. They looked at corporate governance and project management. They also included some technical and prescriptive recommendations. And I think it's important to note they draw on broadly used industry standards, things that are used for tailings facilities. And all of those recommendations were delivered with the goal of reducing the likelihood of this failure ever happening, improving our practices in the Yukon, and kind of maturing our industry here in the Yukon. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but we've got industry recommendations that go from corporate governance, project governance, defensive design, and monitoring, making sure that what you're designing is being built if what's happening on site doesn't make sense with what your assumptions were, you're correcting those. On a regulatory and compliance standpoint, making sure that our license terms are appropriate for the facility we're licensing, making sure that we understand what's happening on site, reviewing, making sure our reports are simple, straightforward, and focused on the things that are really important to know, and ensuring that we have the right staffing to match the demand for an individual site, but also for mining industry as a whole. And then Yukon government issued these guidelines in February of 2023, and I think 37 of the recommendations that the board has suggested fit within a revision to these guidelines, and they've suggested that we use a committee to do that and look at improving those guidelines to improve future heap leaching facilities, but also future mining. So I think it's important to note all of the recommendations are reasonable. They're all strong. The conversations we've had with people across industry, they make sense. There's work that we're doing right now to look at how to incorporate them into existing licenses, how to strengthen our regulatory processes, and really learn from this event and then grow. I'm running out of time, so I just wanted to thank you. I think there's almost 400 different suppliers and contractors working on this site. So this is not all of them, but a big thank you to everyone who has supported this project and helped us see the successes that we have to date.